Section 13 of Psychopathology of Everyday Life. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Psychopathology of Everyday Life by Sigmund Freud, translated by A. Brill, read by Mary Schneider. Chapter 12. Determinism, Chance, and Superstitious Beliefs. Part 2. 3. Although conscious thought must be altogether ignorant of the motivation of the faulty actions described above, yet it would be desirable to discover a psychologic proof of its existence. Indeed, reasons obtained through a deeper knowledge of the unconscious make it probable that such proofs are to be discovered somewhere. As a matter of fact, phenomena can be demonstrated in two spheres, which seem to correspond to an unconscious and hence to a displaced knowledge of those motives. A. It is a striking and generally to be recognized feature in the behavior of paranoiacs that they attach the greatest significance to the trivial details in the behavior of others. Details which are usually overlooked by others, they interpret and utilize as the basis of far-reaching conclusions. For example, the last paranoiac seen by me concluded that there was a general understanding among people of his environment because at his departure from the railway station they made a certain motion with one hand. Another noticed how people walked on the street, how they brandished their walking sticks, and the like. The category of the accidental, requiring no motivation, which the normal person lets pass as a part of his own psychic activities and faulty actions, is thus rejected by the paranoiac in the application to the psychic manifestations to others. All that he observes in others is full of meaning, all is explainable. But how does he come to look at it in this manner? Probably here, as in many other cases, he projects into the mental life of others what exists in his own unconscious activity. Many things obtrude themselves on consciousness in paranoia, which in normal and neurotic persons can only be demonstrated through psychoanalysis as existing in their unconscious. In a certain sense, the paranoiac is here justified. He perceives something that escapes the normal person. He sees clearer than one of normal intellectual capacity. But his knowledge becomes worthless when he imputes to others the state of affairs he thus recognizes. I hope that I shall not be expected to justify every paranoiac interpretation, but the point which we grant to paranoia in this conception of chance actions will facilitate for us the psychologic understanding of the conviction which the paranoiac attaches to all these interpretations. There is certainly some truth to it. Even our errors of judgment, which are not designated as morbid, acquire their feeling of conviction in the same way. This feeling is justified for a certain part of the erroneous train of thought, or for the source of its origin, and we shall later extend it to the remaining relationships. B. The phenomena of superstition furnish another indication of the unconscious motivation in chance and faulty actions. I will make myself clear through the discussion of a simple experience which gave me the starting point to these reflections. Having returned from vacation, my thoughts immediately turned to the patients with whom I was to occupy myself in the beginning of my year's work. My first visit was to a very old woman, for whom I had twice daily performed the same professional services for many years. Owing to this monotony, unconscious thoughts have often found expression on the way to the patient and during my occupation with her. She was over 90 years old. It was therefore pertinent to ask oneself at the beginning of each year how much longer she was likely to live. On the day of which I speak, I was in a hurry and took a carriage to her house. Every coachman at the cab stand near my house knew the old woman's address, as each of them had often driven me there. This day it happened that the driver did not stop in front of her house, but before one of the same number in a nearby and really similar-looking parallel street. I noticed the mistake and reproached the coachman, who apologized for it. Is it of any significance when I am taken to a house where the old woman is not to be found? Certainly not to me, but were I superstitious, I should see an omen in this incident, a hint of fate that this would be the last year for the old woman. A great many omens which have been preserved by history have been founded on no better symbolism. Of course, I explain the incident as an accident without further meaning. The case would have been entirely different had I come on foot, and, absorbed in thought or through distraction, I had gone to the house on the parallel street instead of the correct one. I would not explain that as an accident, but as an action with unconscious intent requiring interpretation. My explanation of this lapse in walking would probably be that I expected that the time would soon come when I should not meet the old woman any longer. I therefore differ from a superstitious person in the following manner. I do not believe that an occurrence in which my mental life takes no part can teach me anything hidden concerning the future shaping of reality. But I do believe that an unintentional manifestation of my mental activity surely contains something concealed which belongs only to my mental life. That is, I believe in outer, real chance, but not in inner, psychic accidents. With the superstitious person the case is reversed. He knows nothing of the motive of his chance and faulty actions. He believes in the existence of psychic contingencies. He is therefore inclined to attribute meaning to external chance, which manifests itself in actual occurrence, and to see in the accident a means of expression for something hidden outside of him. There are two differences between me and the superstitious person. First, he projects the motive to the outside, while I look for it in myself. Second, he explains the accident by an event which I trace to a thought. What he considers hidden corresponds to the unconscious with me, and the compulsion not to let chance pass as chance, but to explain it as common to both of us. Thus I admit that this conscious ignorance and unconscious knowledge of the motivation of psychic accidentalness is one of the psychic roots of superstition, because the superstitious person knows nothing of the motivation of his own accidental actions, and because the fact of this motivation strives for a place in his recognition, he is compelled to dispose of them by displacing them into the outer world. If such a connection exists, it can hardly be limited to this single case. As a matter of fact, I believe that a large portion of the mythological conception of the world, which reaches far into the most modern religions, is nothing but psychology projected into the outer world. The dim perception, the endo-psychic perception, as it were, of psychic factors and relations, of the unconscious, was taken as a model in the construction of a transcendental reality, which is destined to be changed again by science into psychology of the unconscious. It is difficult to express it in other terms. The analogy to paranoia must come to our aid. We venture to explain in this way the myths of paradise and the fall of man, of God, of good and evil, of immortality, and the like. That is to transform metaphysics into metapsychology. The gap between the paranoiac's displacement and that of superstition is narrower than appears at first sight. When human beings began to think, they were obviously compelled to explain the outer world in an anthropomorphic sense by a multitude of personalities in their own image. The accidents which they explained superstitiously were thus actions and expressions of persons. In that regard they behaved just like paranoiacs, who draw conclusions from insignificant signs which others give them, and like all normal persons who justly take the unintentional actions of their fellow beings as a basis for the estimation of their characters. Only in our modern philosophical, but by no means finished, views of life does superstition seem so much out of place. In the view of life of the pre-scientific times and nations, it was justified and consistent. The Roman who gave up an important undertaking because he sighted an ill-omened flock of birds was relatively right. His action was consistent with his principles. But if he withdrew from an undertaking because he had stumbled on his threshold, he was absolutely superior even to us unbelievers. He was a better psychologist than we are striving to become, for his stumbling could demonstrate to him the existence of a doubt, an internal counter-current, the force of which could weaken the power of his intention at the moment of its execution. For only by concentrating all psychic powers on the desired aim can one be assured of perfect success. How does Schiller's Tell, who hesitated so long to shoot the apple from his son's head, answer the bailiff's question why he had provided himself with a second arrow? With a second arrow I would have pierced you, had I struck my dear child, and truly I should not have failed to reach you. 4. Whoever has had the opportunity of studying the concealed psychic feelings of persons by means of psychoanalysis can also tell something new concerning the quality of unconscious motives which express themselves in superstition. Nervous persons afflicted with compulsive thinking and compulsive states, who are often very intelligent, show very plainly that superstition originates from repressed, hostile, and cruel impulses. The greater part of superstition signifies fear of impending evil, and he who has frequently wished evil to others, but because of a good bringing up has repressed the same into the unconscious, will be particularly apt to expect punishment for such unconscious evil in the form of a misfortune threatening him from without. If we concede that we have by no means exhausted the psychology of superstition in these remarks, we must, on the other hand, at least touch upon the question whether real roots of superstition should be altogether denied, whether there are really no omens, prophetic dreams, telepathic experiences, manifestations of supernatural forces, and the like. I am now far from willing to repudiate without anything further all these phenomena, concerning which we possess so many minute observations even from men of intellectual prominence, and which should certainly form a basis for further investigation. We may even hope that some of these observations will be explained by our present knowledge of the unconscious psychic processes, without necessitating radical changes in our present aspect. If still other phenomena, as, for example, those maintained by the spiritualists, should be proven, we should then consider the modification of our laws as demanded by the new experience, without becoming confused in regard to the relation of things of this world. In the sphere of these analyses I can only answer the questions here proposed subjectively, that is, in accordance with my personal experience. I am sorry to confess that I belong to that class of unworthy individuals before whom the spirits cease their activities and the supernatural disappears, so that I have never been in position to experience anything personally that would stimulate belief in the miraculous. Like everybody else, I have had forebodings and experienced misfortunes, but the two evaded each other, so that nothing followed the foreboding, and the misfortune struck me unannounced. When as a young man I lived alone in a strange city, I frequently heard my name suddenly pronounced by an unmistakable dear voice, and I then made a note of the exact moment of the hallucination, in order to inquire carefully of those at home what had occurred at that time. There was nothing to it. On the other hand, I later worked among my patients calmly and without foreboding, while my child almost bled to death. Nor have I ever been able to recognize as unreal phenomena any of the forebodings reported to me by my patients. The belief in prophetic dreams numbers many adherents, because it can be supported by the fact that some things really so happen in the future as they were previously foretold by the wish of the dream. But in this there is little to be wondered at, as many far-reaching deviations may be regularly demonstrated between a dream and the fulfillment, which the credulity of the dreamer prefers to neglect. A nice example, one which may be justly called prophetic, was once brought to me for exhaustive analysis by an intelligent and truth-loving patient. She related that she once dreamed that she had met a former friend and family physician in front of a certain store in a certain street, and the next morning, when she went downtown, she actually met him at the place named in the dream. I may observe that the significance of this wonderful coincidence was not proven to be due to any subsequent event; that is, it could not be justified through future occurrences. Careful examination definitely established the fact that there was no proof that the woman recalled the dream in the morning following the night of the dream, that is, before the walk and before the meeting. She could offer no objection when this state of affairs was presented in a manner that robbed this episode of everything miraculous, leaving only an interesting psychologic problem. One morning she had walked through this very street, had met her old family physician before that certain store, and on seeing him received the conviction that during the preceding night she had dreamed of this meeting at this place. The analysis then showed with great probability how she came to this conviction, to which, in accordance with the general rule, we cannot deny a certain right to credence. A meeting at a definite place, following a previous expectation, really describes the fact of a rendezvous. The old family physician awakened her memory of old times, when meetings with a third person, also a friend of the physician, were of marked significance to her. Since that time she had continued her relations with this gentleman, and the day before the mentioned dream she had waited for him in vain. If I could report in greater detail the circumstances here before us, I could easily show that the illusion of the prophetic dream at the sight of the friend of former times is perchance equivalent to the following speech: "Ah, doctor, you now remind me of my bygone times, when I never had to wait in vain for N. when we had arranged a meeting." I have observed in myself a simple and easily explained example, which is probably a good model for similar occurrences of those familiar remarkable coincidences, wherein we meet a person of whom we were just thinking. During a walk through the inner city a few days after the title of Professor was bestowed on me, which carries with it a great deal of prestige even in monarchical cities, my thoughts suddenly merged into a childish revenge fantasy against a certain married couple. Some months previous they had called me to see their little daughter, who suffered from an interesting convulsive manifestation following the appearance of a dream. I took a great interest in the case, the genesis of which I believed I could surmise, but the parents were unfavorable to my treatment, and gave me to understand that they thought of applying to a foreign authority, who cured by means of hypnotism. I now fancied that after the failure of this attempt, the parents begged me to resume my treatment, that they now had full confidence in me, etc. But I answered, "Now that I have become a professor, you have confidence in me. The title has made no change in my ability. If you could not use me when I was instructor, you can get along without me now that I am professor." At this point my fantasy was interrupted by a loud "Good morning, Professor," and as I looked up there passed me the same couple on whom I had just taken this imaginary vengeance. The next reflection destroyed the semblance of the miraculous. I was walking towards this couple on a straight, almost deserted street, glancing up hastily at a distance of perhaps 20 steps from me. I had spied and realized their stately personalities. But this perception, following the model of a negative hallucination, was set aside by certain emotionally accentuated motives, and then asserted itself in the apparently spontaneous emerging fantasy. A similar experience is related by Brill, which also throws some light on the nature of telepathy. Quote, "While engrossed in conversation during our customary Sunday evening dinner at one of the large New York restaurants, I suddenly stopped and irrelevantly remarked to my wife, 'I wonder how Dr. R. is doing in Pittsburgh.' She looked at me much astonished and said, Why, that is exactly what I have been thinking for the last few seconds. Either you have transferred this thought to me, or I have transferred it to you. How can you otherwise explain this strange phenomenon?" I had to admit that I could offer no solution. Our conversation throughout the dinner showed not the remotest association to Dr. R., nor, so far as our memories went, had we heard or spoken of him for some time. Being a skeptic, I refused to admit that there was anything mysterious about it, although inwardly I felt quite uncertain. To be frank, I was somewhat mystified. But we did not remain very long in this state of mind, for on looking toward the cloakroom we were surprised to see Dr. R. Though closer inspection showed our mistake, we were both struck by the remarkable resemblance of this stranger to Dr. R. From the position of the cloakroom we were forced to conclude that this stranger had passed our table. Absorbed in our conversation, we had not noticed him consciously, but the visual image had stirred up the association of this double Dr. R. That we should both have experienced the same thought is also quite natural. The last word from our friend was to the effect that he had taken up private practice in Pittsburgh, and, being aware of the vicissitudes that beset the beginner, it was quite natural to wonder how fortune smiled upon him. What promised to be a supernatural manifestation was thus easily explained on a normal basis. But had we not noticed the stranger before he left the restaurant, it would have been impossible to exclude the mysterious. I venture to say that such simple mechanisms are at the bottom of the most complicated telepathic manifestations. At least, such has been my experience in all cases accessible to investigation." End quote. Another solution of an apparent foreboding was reported by Otto Rank. Quote, "Some time ago I had experienced a remarkable variation of that peculiar coincidence wherein one meets a person who has just been occupying one's thoughts. Shortly before Christmas I went to the Austro-Hungarian Bank in order to obtain 10 new silver crown pieces destined for Christmas gifts. Absorbed in ambitious fantasies which dealt with the contrast of my meagre means to the enormous sums in the banking house, I turned into the narrow street to the bank. In front of the door I saw an automobile and many people going in and out. I thought to myself, the officials will have plenty of time for my new crowns. Naturally, I shall be quick about it. I shall put down the paper notes to be exchanged, and say, 'Please give me gold.' I realized my mistake at once. I was to have said for silver, and awoke from my fantasies. I was now only a few steps from the entrance, and noticed a young man coming toward me, who looked familiar, but whom I could not identify definitely on account of my short-sightedness. As he came nearer, I recognized him as a classmate of my brother, whose name was Gold, and from whose brother, a well-known journalist, I had great expectations in the beginning of my literary career. But these expectations had not materialized, and with them had vanished the hoped-for material success with which my fantasies were occupying themselves on my way to the bank. Thus engrossed, I must have unconsciously perceived the approach of Mr. Gold, who impressed himself on my conscience while I was dreaming on material success, and thereby caused me to ask the cashier for gold instead of the inferior silver. But on the other hand, the paradoxical fact that my unconscious was able to perceive an object long before it was recognized by the eye might in part be explained by the complex readiness of Bleuler, for my mind was attuned to the material, and, contrary to my better knowledge, it guided my steps from the very beginning to buildings where gold and paper money were exchanged." End quote. To the category of the wonderful and uncanny we may also add that strange feeling we perceive in certain moments and situations when it seems as if we have already had exactly the same experience, or had previously found ourselves in the same situation. Yet we are never successful in our efforts to recall clearly those former experiences and situations. I know that I follow only the loose colloquial expression when I designate that which stimulates us in such moments as a feeling. We undoubtedly deal with a judgment, and indeed with a judgment of cognition, but these cases nevertheless have a character peculiar to themselves, and besides we must not ignore the fact that we never recall what we are seeking. I do not know whether this phenomenon of déjà vu was ever seriously offered as a proof of a former psychic existence of the individual, but it is certain that psychologists have taken an interest in it, and have attempted to solve the riddle in a multitude of speculative ways. None of the proposed tentative explanations seem right to me, because none takes account of anything but the accompanying manifestations and the favoring conditions of the phenomenon. Those psychic processes which, according to my observation, are alone responsible for the explanation of the déjà vu, namely the unconscious fantasies, are generally neglected by psychologists even today. I believe that it is wrong to designate the feeling of having experienced something before as an illusion. On the contrary, in such moments, something is really touched that we have already experienced, only we cannot consciously recall the latter because it never was conscious. In short, the feeling of déjà vu corresponds to the memory of an unconscious fantasy. There are unconscious fantasies or daydreams, just as there are similar conscious creations, which every one knows from personal experience. I realize that the object is worthy of most minute study, but I will here give the analysis of only one case of déjà vu, in which the feeling was characterized by particular intensity and persistence. A woman of 37 years asserted that she most distinctly remembered that at the age of 12 and a half she paid her first visit to some school friends in the country, and as she entered the garden she immediately had the feeling of having been there before. This feeling was repeated as she went through the living rooms, so that she believed she knew beforehand how big the next room was, what views one could have on looking out of it, etc. But the belief that this feeling of recognition might have its source in a previous visit to the house and garden, perhaps a visit paid in earliest childhood, was absolutely excluded and disproved by statements from her parents. The woman who related this sought no psychologic explanation, but saw in the appearance of this feeling a prophetic reference to the importance which these friends later assumed in her emotional life. On taking into consideration, however, the circumstance under which this phenomenon presented itself to her, we found the way to another conception. When she decided upon this visit, she knew that these girls had an only brother who was seriously ill. In the course of the visit she actually saw him. She found him looking very badly, and thought to herself that he would soon die. But it happened that her own only brother had had a serious attack of diphtheria some months before, and during his illness she had lived for weeks with relatives far from her parental home. She believed that her brother was taking part in this visit to the country, imagined even that this was his first long journey since his illness. Still, her memory was remarkably indistinct in regard to these points, whereas all other details, and particularly the dress which she wore that day, remained most clearly before her eyes. To the initiated it will not be difficult to conclude from these suggestions that the expectation of her brother's death had played a great part in the girl's mind at that time, and that either it never became conscious, or it was more energetically repressed after the favorable issue of the illness. Under other circumstances she would have been compelled to wear another dress, namely mourning clothes. She found the analogous situation in her friend's home. Their only brother was in danger of an early death, an event that really came to pass a short time after. She might have consciously remembered that she had lived through a similar situation a few months previous. But instead of recalling what was inhibited through repression, she transferred the memory feeling to the locality, to the garden and the house, and merged into it the faux reconnaissance that she had already seen everything exactly as it was. From the fact of the repression, we may conclude that the former expectation of the death of her brother was not far from evincing the character of a wish fantasy. She would then have become the only child. In her later neurosis, she suffered in the most intense manner from the fear of losing her parents, behind which the analysis disclosed, as usual, the unconscious wish of the same content. My own experience of déjà vu I can trace in a similar manner to the emotional constellation of the moment. It may be expressed as follows. That would be another occasion for awakening certain fantasies, unconscious and unknown, which were formed in me at one time or another as a wish to improve my situation. 5. Recently, when I had occasion to recite to a colleague of a philosophical turn of mind some examples of name forgetting, with their analyses, he hastened to reply, "That is all very well, but with me the forgetting of a name proceeds in a different manner." Evidently one cannot dismiss this question as simply as that. I do not believe that my colleague had ever thought of an analysis for the forgetting of a name, nor could he say how the process differed in him. But his remark, nevertheless, touches upon a problem which many would be inclined to place in the foreground. Does the solution given for faulty and chance actions apply in general or only in particular cases? And if only in the latter, what are the conditions under which it may also be employed in the explanation of the other phenomena? In answer to this question, my experiences leave me in the lurch. I can only urge against considering the demonstrated connections as rare, for as often as I have made the test in myself and with my patients, it was always definitely demonstrated exactly as in the examples reported, or there were at least good reasons to assume this. One should not be surprised, however, when one does not succeed every time in finding the concealed meaning of the symptomatic action, as the amount of inner resistances ranging themselves against the solution must be considered a deciding factor. Also, it is not always possible to explain every individual dream of one's self or of patients. To substantiate the general validity of the theory, it is enough if one can penetrate only a certain distance into the hidden associations. The dream which proves refractory when the solution is attempted on the following day can often be robbed of its secret a week or a month later, when the psychic factors combating one another have been reduced as a consequence of a real change that has meanwhile taken place. The same applies to the solution of faulty and symptomatic actions. It would therefore be wrong to affirm of all cases which resist analysis that they are caused by another psychic mechanism than that here revealed. Such assumption requires more than negative proofs. Moreover, the readiness to believe in a different explanation of faulty and symptomatic actions, which probably exists universally in all normal persons, does not prove anything. It is obviously an expression of the same psychic forces which produced the secret, which therefore strives to protect and struggle against its elucidation. On the other hand, we must not overlook the fact that the repressed thoughts and feelings are not independent in attaining expression in symptomatic and faulty actions. The technical possibility for such an adjustment of the innervations may be furnished independently of them, and this is then gladly utilized by the intention of the repressed material to come to conscious expression. In the case of linguistic faulty actions, an attempt has been made by philosophers and philologists to verify through minute observations what structural and functional relations enter into the service of such intention. If in the determinations of faulty and symptomatic actions we separate the unconscious motive from its coactive physiological and psychophysical relations, the question remains open whether there are still other factors within normal limits which, like the unconscious motive, and in its place, can produce faulty and symptomatic actions on the road of the relations. It is not my task to answer this question. 6. Since the discussion of speech blunders, we have been content to demonstrate that faulty actions have a concealed motive, and through the aid of psychoanalysis we have traced our way to the knowledge of their motivation. The general nature and peculiarities of the psychic factors brought to expression in these faulty actions we have hitherto left almost without consideration. At any rate, we have not attempted to define them more accurately or to examine into their lawfulness. Nor will we now attempt a thorough elucidation of the subject, as the first steps have already taught us that it is more feasible to enter this structure from another side. Here we can put before ourselves certain questions, which I will cite in their order. 1. What is the content and the origin of the thoughts and feelings which show themselves through faulty and chance actions? 2. What are the conditions which force a thought or a feeling to make use of these occurrences as a means of expression and place it in a position to do so? 3. Can constant and definite associations be demonstrated between the manner of the faulty action and the qualities brought to expression through it? I shall begin by bringing together some material for answering the last question. In the discussion of the examples of speech blunders, we found it necessary to go beyond the contents of the intended speech, and we had to seek the cause of the speech disturbance outside the intention. The latter was quite clear in a series of cases, and was known to the consciousness of the speaker. In the example that seemed most simple and transparent, it was a similar sounding but different conception of the same thought, which disturbed its expression without any one being able to say why the one succumbed and the other came to the surface. In a second group of cases, one conception succumbed to a motive, which did not, however, prove strong enough to cause complete submersion. The conception which was withheld was clearly presented to consciousness. Only of the third group can we affirm unreservedly that the disturbing thought differed from the one intended, and it is obvious that it may establish an essential distinction. The disturbing thought is either connected with the disturbed one through a thought association, disturbance through inner contradiction, or it is substantially strange to it, and just the disturbed word is connected with the disturbing thought through a surprising outer association which is frequently unconscious. In the examples which I have given from my psychoanalyses, it is found that the entire speech is either under the influence of thoughts which have become active simultaneously, or under the absolutely unconscious thoughts which betray themselves either through the disturbance itself, or which evince an indirect influence by making it possible for the individual parts of the unconsciously intended speech to disturb one another. The retained or unconscious thoughts, from which the disturbances in speech emanate, are of most varied origin. A general survey does not reveal any definite direction. Comparative examinations of examples of mistakes in reading and writing lead to the same conclusions. Isolated cases, as in speech blunders, seem to owe their origin to an unmotivated work of condensation. But we should be pleased to know whether special conditions must not be fulfilled in order that such condensation, which is considered regular in the dream work and faulty in our waking thoughts, should take place. No information concerning this can be obtained from the examples themselves, but I merely refuse from this to draw the conclusion that there are no such conditions, as for instance the relaxation of conscious attention, for I have learned elsewhere that automatic actions are especially characterized by correctness and reliability. I would rather emphasize the fact that here, as so frequently in biology, it is the normal relations, or those approaching the normal, that are less favorable objects for investigation than the pathological. What remains obscure in the explanation of these most simple disturbances will, according to my expectation, be made clear through the explanation of more serious disturbances. Also, mistakes in reading and writing do not lack examples in which more remote and more complicated motivation can be recognized. There is no doubt that the disturbances of the speech functions occur more easily and make less demand on the disturbing forces than other psychic acts. But one is on different ground when it comes to the examination of forgetting in the literal sense, that is, the forgetting of past experiences. To distinguish this forgetting from the others, we designate sensu strictiori, the forgetting of proper names and foreign words, as in chapters 1 and 2, as slips, and the forgetting of resolutions as omissions. The principal conditions of the normal process of forgetting are unknown. We are also reminded of the fact that not all is forgotten which we believe to be. Our explanation here deals only with those cases in which the forgetting arouses our astonishment, in so far as it infringes the rule that the unimportant is forgotten, while the important matter is guarded by memory. Analysis of these examples of forgetting, which seem to demand a special explanation, shows that the motive of forgetting is always an unwillingness to recall something which may evoke painful feelings. We come to the conjecture that this motive universally strives for expression in psychic life, but is inhibited through other and contrary forces from regularly manifesting itself. The extent and significance of this dislike to recall painful impressions seems worthy of the most painstaking psychologic investigation. The question as to what special conditions render possible the universally resistant forgetting in individual cases cannot be solved through this added association. A different factor steps into the foreground in the forgetting of resolutions. The supposed conflict resulting in the repression of the painful memory becomes tangible, and in the analysis of the examples one regularly recognizes a counter will, which opposes but does not put an end to the resolution. As in previously discussed faulty acts, we here also recognize two types of the psychic process. The counter will either turns directly against the resolution in intentions of some consequence, or it is substantially foreign to the resolution itself, and establishes its connection with it through an outer association, in almost indifferent resolutions. The same conflict governs the phenomena of erroneously carried out actions. The impulse which manifests itself in the disturbances of the action is frequently a counter impulse. Still oftener it is altogether a strange impulse, which only utilizes the opportunity to express itself through a disturbance in the execution of the action. The cases in which the disturbance is the result of an inner contradiction are the most significant ones, and also deal with the more important activities. The inner conflict in the chance or symptomatic actions then merges into the background. Those motor expressions which are least thought of, or are entirely overlooked by consciousness, serve as the expression of numerous unconscious or restrained feelings. For the most part they represent symbolically wishes and phantoms. The first question, as to the origin of the thoughts and emotions which find expression in faulty actions, we can answer by saying that in a series of cases The origin of the disturbing thoughts can be readily traced to repressed emotions of the psychic life. Even in healthy persons, egotistic, jealous, and hostile feelings and impulses, burdened by the pressure of moral education, often utilize the path of faulty actions to express in some way their undeniably existing force, which is not recognized by the higher psychic instances. Allowing these faulty and chance actions to continue corresponds in great part to a comfortable toleration of the unmoral. The manifold sexual currents play no insignificant part in these repressed feelings. That they appear so seldom in the thoughts revealed by the analyses of my examples is simply a matter of coincidence. As I have undertaken the analyses of numerous examples from my own psychic life, the selection was partial from the first, and aimed at the exclusion of sexual matters. At other times it seems that the disturbing thoughts originated from the most harmless objection and consideration. We have now reached the answer to the second question, that is, what psychologic conditions are responsible for the fact that a thought must seek expression, not in its complete form, but as it were in parasitic form, as a modification and disturbance of another. From the most striking examples of faulty actions, it is quite obvious that this determinant should be sought in a relation to conscious capacity, or in the more or less firmly pronounced character of the repressed material. But an examination of this series of examples shows that this character consists of many indistinct elements. The tendency to overlook something because it is wearisome, or because the concerned thought does not really belong to the intended matter. These feelings seem to play the same rôle as motives for the suppression of a thought, which later depends for expression on the disturbance of another, as the moral condemnation of a rebellious emotional feeling, or as the origin of absolutely unconscious trains of thought. An insight into the general nature of the condition of faulty and chance actions cannot be gained in this way. However, this investigation gives us one single significant fact. The more harmless the motivation of the faulty act, the less obnoxious, and hence the less incapable of consciousness, the thought to which it gives expression is. The easier also becomes the solution of the phenomenon after we have turned our attention toward it. The simplest cases of speech blunders are immediately noticed and spontaneously corrected. Where one deals with motivation through actually repressed feelings, the solution requires a painstaking analysis, which may sometimes strike against difficulties or turn out unsuccessful. One is therefore justified in taking the result of this last investigation as an indication of the fact that the satisfactory explanation of the psychologic determinations of faulty and chance actions is to be acquired in another way and from another source. The indulgent reader can therefore see in these discussions the demonstration of the surfaces of fracture in which this theme was quite artificially evolved from a broader connection. 7. Just a few words to indicate the direction of this broader connection. The mechanism of the faulty and chance actions, as we have learned to know it through the application of analysis, shows the most essential points in agreement with the mechanism of dream formation, which I have discussed in the chapter The Dream Work of my book in the Interpretation of Dreams. Here, as there, one finds the condensation and compromise formation, contamination. In addition, the situation is much the same, since unconscious thoughts find expression as modifications of other thoughts in unusual ways and through outer associations. The incongruities, absurdities, and errors in the dream content, by virtue of which the dream is scarcely recognized as a psychic achievement, originate in the same way, to be sure through freer usage of the existing material, as the common error of our everyday life. Here, as there, the appearance of the incorrect function is explained through the peculiar interference of two or more correct actions. An important conclusion can be drawn from this combination. The peculiar mode of operation, whose most striking function we recognize in the dream content, should not be adjudged only to the sleeping state of the psychic life, when we possess abundant proof of its activity during the waking state in the form of faulty actions. The same connection also forbids us assuming that these psychic processes, which impress us as abnormal and strange, are determined by deep-seated decay of psychic activity or by morbid state of function. The correct understanding of this strange psychic work, which allows the faulty actions to originate like the dream pictures, will only be possible after we have discovered that the psychoneurotic symptoms, particularly the psychic formations of hysteria and compulsion neurosis, repeat in their mechanisms all the essential features of this mode of operation. The continuation of our investigation would therefore have to begin at this point. There is still another special interest for us in considering the faulty chance and the symptomatic actions in the light of this last analogy. If we compare them to the function of the psychoneuroses and the neurotic symptoms, two frequently recurring statements gain in sense and support, namely that the border line between the nervous, normal, and abnormal states is indistinct, and that we are all slightly nervous. Regardless of all medical experience, one may construe various types of such barely suggested nervousness, the formes frustes of the neuroses. There may be cases in which only a few symptoms appear, or they may manifest themselves rarely or in mild forms. The extenuation may be transferred to the number, intensity, or to the temporal outbreak of the morbid manifestation. It may also happen that just this type, which forms the most frequent transition between health and disease, may never be discovered. The transition type, whose morbid manifestations come in the form of faulty and symptomatic actions, is characterized by the fact that the symptoms are transformed to the least important psychic activities, while everything that can lay claim to a higher psychic value remains free from disturbance. When the symptoms are disposed of in a reverse manner, that is, when they appear in the most important individual and social activities in a manner to disturb the functions of nourishment and sexual relations, professional and social life, such disposition is found in the severe cases of neurosis, and is perhaps more characteristic of the latter than the multiformity or vividness of the morbid manifestations. But the common characteristic of the mildest as well as the severest cases, to which the faulty and chance actions contribute, lies in the ability to refer the phenomena to unwelcome, repressed psychic material, which, though pushed away from consciousness, is nevertheless not robbed of all capacity to express itself. That is the end of the Psychopathology of Everyday Life.